Intimate Judaism deals with sensitive topics and uses explicit language. Listener discretion is advised. Welcome to Intimate Judaism. I'm Rabbi Scott Kahn.
And I'm Talli Rosenbaum, and today we're going to be doing our annual questions and answers episode.
This episode is always a lot of fun, always get some interesting questions, and this year was no exception, Talli. We'll get to that in just a minute. First, check out our website, intimatejudaism.com, for the full podcast archive, show notes, a free men's mikveh checklist, and more. Subscribe to Intimate Judaism wherever you get your podcasts. Rate and review and leave us a comment. Tell people about Intimate Judaism and share the podcast so that we can continue to grow our ever-widening audience. Please join the Intimate Judaism team on Patreon. Patreon supporters get bonus material, episodes, merch, and more. You can find the link in the description of this podcast. Write to us at intimatejudaism@jewishcoffeehouse.com. Visit jewishcoffeehouse.com and tallirosenbaum.com.
Okay, you're also welcome to Instagram, where we have an Intimate Judaism handle on Instagram as well as Talli Rosenbaum. So please join us there as well. I also, before I start the questions, just want to thank everyone for all the questions that you send in. And we apologize in advance if we didn't get to your question or if we didn't answer a question. We usually do try to answer people. So if you asked us a question and we didn't answer it personally, or we didn't answer it on this episode, please send it again and we'll hope to get to it next time. Thanks for your comments. We get a lot of positive feedback, which we're really happy about. We don't start our episode with these great letters that we get, but maybe in the course of today, we'll get some comments in there so that we can kind of share the happiness. We don't always get positive feedback. We also get some authentic, building, critical feedback as well. So thanks everybody for everything that you have to say.
It's all welcome. And just to echo what Talli said, we never intentionally ignore correspondence. Sometimes it happens unintentionally. So if we haven't answered your question, either on the podcast or personally, we can't promise to get to it, but please do write to us again. We'll do our best.
And we also really appreciate your recommendations and requests for episodes. We just got a few in this week that I think we're definitely going to think about. Like somebody asked us about doing an episode on mental health conditions in marriage, and that's certainly really important. So we hope to do that as well. A few times we've been asked about doing a podcast episode on seniors, and we will certainly put that on our schedule as well. So with no further background noise, let's go on and let's start with the first question. Our listener asks, the following was said by Dr. Samantha Rodman Whiten, a secular therapist. And I'm going to quote, "If you are waiting to have any kind of sexual contact at all prior to marriage, then one thing to do is recognize that there is a very strong possibility that your partner will not enjoy sex at all. If it is very important to you to be religious and celibate prior to marriage, then your religion needs to be thought of as the primary priority in your life. There is no free lunch in life. If you are religious enough to completely eschew the idea of figuring out sexual compatibility prior to marriage, you need to make the decision not to blame your partner if they turn out to be not compatible with you in this domain, and to live a life that is more about religion than sex. If more people were clear about this choice, it's likely that there would be fewer unhappily married couples, at least in the sexual realm. I think this is spot on. When one keeps the halacha without touching before marriage, you need to be willing to take a chance that you might not be sexually compatible." Okay, so do you want to start with that?
All right, I'll start off and then you'll respond. Because Talli, I have no idea. There's no way I could possibly know if what she's describing is a very common reality or something which is quite rare. She's making a sweeping assumption that if you are religious, I'll actually quote. She says, one thing to do is recognize that there is a very strong possibility that your partner will not enjoy sex at all. To me, that sounds like a sweeping statement, which I'm guessing is not that accurate. A very strong possibility to me sounds an over-exaggeration, to say the least. And I question whether the author even meant it to that degree. So first of all, I don't know whether this is necessarily true or how often it's true. That said, I'm sure it's sometimes true. In fact, I hope we'll get to another question today that also relates to something similar about sexual compatibility. The element that I would like to discuss right now briefly is this concept of halacha as ol malchut shamayim, as accepting the yoke of heaven, a certain type of not getting everything that you want. And you can take this as far as you like. You can really take this statement that the author wrote and go further. You can say, if you care about the laws of negiah and not having sex all the time, but only when halacha permits it, then that means you care about religion more than sex. Frankly, if you care about the laws of kashrut and you can't eat everything you want whenever you want, that means you care more about religion than food. If we keep Shabbat, that means you care about religion more than you care about making a living. Ultimately, this concept and this statement becomes meaningless because you can say it about anything, saying that if you don't have sex before you get married, therefore you care about religion more than sex. So on some level, that's true, but I'm not sure it's actually a meaningful statement. So my ultimate answer to this, to the degree I'm answering it at all, just my comment, I guess, is saying, okay, there's some truth there, I suppose, though I don't know the research, as I said, but I'm not sure it's a meaningful piece of information anyway, because we all give up things. It doesn't mean it's easy for those who have this issue with compatibility, of course, but at the same time, I'd say, Azma, therefore what? What are you saying? So I shouldn't care about religion anymore? Halacha shouldn't mean anything to me? Okay, we have to decide. What am I willing to sacrifice? What am I not willing to sacrifice? And go for it.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what you're saying. I think that I might add a few things. This is written by somebody who has a certain kind of, I would say, premise that, when you reach the age of marriage, you've already kind of developed your sexuality to a point where you could talk about it as being compatible with the other person who's developed their sexuality. And I think we need to recognize that in the context of growing up religious, that's not usually the case. I wouldn't say there's very little. I mean, it's across the spectrum. But generally speaking, sexuality is taught as something that you hold back on. And so by the time you're ready to get married, you're kind of at that same place of learning it together, kind of developing a sexuality based on that being your partner and that being your life partner. So it isn't as though, like when they talk about consent, for example, so they talk about, when you're with a new partner, it's kind of like ordering pizza. I like pizza with mushrooms, I like pizza with onions, and I can't stand anchovies, so we're not going to order anchovies. As if everybody comes to the relationship with their kind of sexual menu or sexual template intact. And I don't think that really happens. I think that we start off, whether we start off a little bit before marriage or whether we start off during marriage or after marriage, we start off without really having much of a creation of a sexuality around the couple. It's the couple. It's a lot of individual sexuality as well. But in the end of the day, you're married to somebody for a long time. You develop kind of a sexuality with each other. Now, that's true for the most part. What I would say is kind of interesting here in terms of sexual compatibility. I don't really know what sexual compatibility means, but what I do know is that there are certain sexual orientations or sexual desires that, for example, in a secular society, you would search for a partner who has those things. So, for example, I have a lot of couples that I will work with where one desires a certain kind of kink, BDSM, or some other sort of form of sexuality, which might be not so vanilla or not so typical or classic. Whereas in the secular world, you might actually look for somebody in advance, who partakes in that sort of thing. It's less likely for that to happen in the frum world, where you may not have even acted it out, or you may have a lot of guilt or shame around it, so you didn't talk about it or disclose it, or, you didn't even know what it was, or you didn't know. Like it just came up later because it wasn't something that you talked about, or it wasn't something that you experienced. And then in those cases, obviously, you will see, and I have seen partners who, they love their partners, but they're just not into that. Like it's just hard for them to understand it and wrap their heads around that. There's one other thing I want to say about this idea of, giving up religion or giving up your sexuality. I mean, I see that as a very binary, obviously. And, we talked here a lot about integrating our parts. And I think that we choose. I do. I think that we choose how important religion and spirituality is to us and is to a way of life. And we also choose how important sexuality is to us. There was an episode that we did on sexual health principles and how they may or may not conflict with religious principles. And I would urge our listeners to go back and listen to that episode, because we really do talk about that in that episode, this kind of how do we integrate these different parts of ourselves.
And the episode you're referring to, Talli, is episode 35, entitled Sex Positivity, Sexual Health, and Sexual Rights. Are these Jewish values? This can be found on intimatejudaism.com or any podcast provider. Let's move on to the next question. I have a question with regard to being shomer when dating someone. For those who don't know, being shomer means not touching before the couple is married. I'm in a situation where I want to date for a longer amount of time. This past Motzei Shabbat, we both slipped and ended up going pretty far, not to the point of sexual intercourse. We started kissing and hugging in the car and ended up moving it to a bed. So it was my first time ever engaging in such an activity. And I want more of an understanding of where I draw the line now. Yesterday, I discussed with him that I would not engage in kissing or lying together until I'm actually engaged. And I drew a line that I could sit on his lap and hug, and that's all. Because now that we slipped, I feel it's hard to go back. But at the same time, I'm discovering that I wish I stayed shomer. Like I'm so unsure of how to take the situation moving forward. Because I do feel that I'm a complex person that needs a longer amount of time dating someone. But at the same time, I just want to get advice on how to move forward. This is a very, very difficult question because emotionally, you can hear that she's truly torn between, it's almost like that previous question, her religious principles, which she inherently and intellectually agrees with, but at the same time, maybe even emotionally, wishes she still were in that place of, I'm going to use this term, of innocence, of not having had that experience. But at the same time, she does, and she likes it. I'm not sure what to answer her. What would you say?
Okay, so I'm hearing that you're having some different feelings about having engaged in some activity. It sounds like it's the first time that you have gone this far, and you seem like you're feeling kind of confused about how to prevent this from happening again. It seems like it was something that you might have felt was not so in your control. It sounds like you feel a little bit regretful. You're saying you wish that it hadn't happened, or you wish you could go back to being shomer. And so, first of all, I'd like to really just say, wow, this is really very normal. I think it happens a lot. And if we look at the positive part of this, I think that there's something really kind of exciting to know that you have this ability to feel so attracted and to feel so attracted to this person who you're dating. So, let's kind of acknowledge that. Your real question is really less about shomer and more about boundaries. You're not saying that you want to necessarily be completely shomer. It's kind of like you've tasted what it's like, and it's a very strong force of nature. It's very natural, but you don't want to go as far as you went before. So first of all, being shomer is kind of seen as a status. Either you're shomer or you're not shomer. And that's already an issue. We've talked about that before, in the sense that you can certainly have done something or tried something, been curious, or kind of got quote unquote swept away. But that doesn't mean that you can't make boundaries and you can't hold by those boundaries. I'd like to address the issue of remorse or regret. I'm not really sure what you regret so much, whether you regret having, let's say, transgressed halacha, for example, or whether you regret having felt what touching feels like, because kind of like this idea of once we did it, once we've kind of tasted that forbidden fruit, so to speak, it is really hard. And I get that. One thing that I don't like about how shomer negiah has been presented is this idea that you're like a diamond, and every time you touch someone, it's like you scratch the diamond. I don't really think that it takes away from your value, and I do believe that you can forgive yourself and decide that you can take the time that you need. I certainly don't think that it makes sense to hurry along and get engaged, especially if you're somebody that feels like you need more time. But if you feel that you want to try again to be shomer, I think that you can. I don't think that shomer is something that it's not like, I don't know, with alcoholism that you're off the, what do they call it?
Off the wagon.
Off
right.
the wagon. You can say, yeah, I wasn't shomer for a little bit. I'm going to try to be now. The fact that you've done things before doesn't mean you need to draw that line there. You can go back to the line wherever you want. It's your body, it's your autonomy, it's your decision. You might want to avoid situations where those things can easily happen. I mean, that's one way to deal with it. Anything that you want to add to that, Scott?
Well, I definitely want to add just one point from a pastoral perspective. You kind of said it, but I think it's important for me to reiterate it, that having done it once doesn't mean you have to do it again. And the fact that you're doing it doesn't mean that you're no longer religious or however you view yourself. We have to look at each thing in isolation. I think, as we've mentioned many times before, this binary idea of either I keep it all or I keep nothing is not healthy, in my opinion. I think you can say that I'm going to do the best I can. If I want to be shomer, then you should try to be shomer, if that matters to you. If it doesn't matter to you, then okay, then do what you do, but Don't let it affect the rest of your religious practice and say, okay, I suppose now I'm not a religious Jew. There's no reason to think that way. We're all struggling with different things. Every person in the world has the thing that he or she is struggling with at any given time. And when I say struggling, it could be that it's not a struggle. It could be a decision as well. But we're all doing certain things. We're all not doing certain things. We're all trying our best to be servants of the Lord. To the degree that you can do what you can, do what you can, and don't let it become something where you have this sense of yeush, of completely giving up the things that you do feel strongly about, the things that are a strong part of your religious identity. I guess what I'm saying to the listener is that the fact that you might decide, I'm not going to be shomer negiah, which again remains a choice, as you said, Talli, but if that is your decision, doesn't mean you have to therefore say, as you also said, I'm going to have sex now, or I'm going to do even more than before, or the same thing as before, or in another area, I'm going to be more lenient or not as careful as I personally would like to be. Define yourself as you would like to define yourself. Don't let actions that you do define yourself as your entire person any more than you want them to.
Yeah, I mean, I would add one thing to that too, is that these are actions that are kind of in your control. In other words, when you say end up, we landed, I think we've talked many times on this podcast about intentionality and that we choose our behaviors. And if you choose to be sexual because it is hard, that's okay. Even having sex, if that's what you choose, then you want to do that with intentionality because you want to make sure that you're using birth control. So the idea here is to recognize that we all face conflicts. And the idea is to be able to be our best selves and not to have to carry around this burden of guilt and shame because we didn't live up to our standards. And so if it's really important to you to live up to those standards, then, you can do that. But other people might say, you know what, this is too hard. And I choose to, yes, engage. I choose to create this boundary when I engage, as long as you know that you are in control of your behavior. You are, at the end of the day, whatever you do is what you choose to do.
That's a really good point. Should we move on to the next question?
Sure.
Here goes. I have a question I would really appreciate being answered either via email or on one of your upcoming podcasts. Without going into too much detail, if you discover something on your husband's internet search history that does not sit comfortably with you, should you approach him on the topic or turn a blind eye? If I should approach it with him, how do I do this knowing it is something that he would not want me to have seen? If I should turn a blind eye, acknowledging that he is human and presume the best, that he has done tshuva and so forth, what practical steps can I take to move on and not let it bug me out? Talli, if it's okay with you, can I take this first from a layman's perspective and then hand it to you from a therapeutic perspective?
Please.
Okay. After thinking about it, my natural inclination is, well, it depends on what it is that you saw and why it is that it bothers you and whether, so to speak, in the writer's view, is it that something which she shouldn't be bothered by, or is it something that she should be bothered by? And I realize all that thinking is actually overthinking it. In my opinion, she should talk to him about it, no matter what, no matter whether she's being overly sensitive. Let's say, for example, I doubt this is what she's talking about, but he watched a football game and there happened to be cheerleaders in the football game, which is one way of looking at it. And then there is the other extreme, which might be that he was watching porn. Either way, the bottom line is that it bothers her. And the fact that it bothers her, regardless of whether I'm putting this in quotes, whether he's guilty or not, whether he did something he shouldn't do or not, she has to talk to him about it because it's going to fester. The very fact that it is something which is eating her up, and perhaps justifiably, is something that she should talk to him about. And I don't think they should let it just go. And it might be an uncomfortable conversation. But I think it's more difficult and perhaps more dangerous to their relationship to have something which is really bothering you about your partner that you're not willing to bring up with him out of fear of what he'll say or that he'll be upset. I think better to get the upset out of the way and be honest about it and have that kind of communication.
First of all, I really like what you said because, my tendency is to agree with the idea of open and honest and authentic communication, and also to approach things with curiosity. I'm very bad at answering the question, what should I do? Because it's really something I don't do in therapy. And I really try to help the person figure it out on their own. So it's a hard question for me to answer. What I could do is kind of talk about the idea of what is your general contract in the marriage regarding privacy as opposed to secrecy, because there's a difference between privacy and secrecy. My sense is that she's also wondering about, she knows that her husband wouldn't want her to see it. And then there's also the question is, what was she doing in his history? or in his phone.
Right.
Are we in a marriage where we freely look into each other's phones? Or do we have kind of an understanding about our phones as being places where, we might not want to have our partners or our children looking into, because there might be private things on there with your friends, or certainly in my case, my professional interactions are extremely discreet. Nobody gets to touch my phone. So there really is a question about what's already acknowledged in their marriage around what are the expectations for privacy. And I think being able to approach it with curiosity. And is that curiosity there? I think what I would want to do if I saw this person was first find out, well, what are you feeling? What are you feeling about what you saw? And, let her process that with herself, so that when she does, or if she does choose to confront her husband, she kind of has a sense of having soothed herself because she knows what she feels about it. Did she feel betrayed? Did she feel shocked? Did she feel afraid or nervous about something? Was this something that she felt that it showed a part of him that she didn't know about? And what was that for her? That's kind of like the long answer, because I can't really tell you, the writer, what to do. But I could certainly suggest that you kind of sit with what you feel about it, and whether you would feel comfortable both sharing those feelings with your husband and also staying curious about what he was looking at and why.
I just want to make one clarification, because I know people sometimes take something you say and then jump on it. And when I said get over the upset, which I think is my quote, I did not mean she shouldn't be upset. I mean, she should get over the fear of making him upset. That's all I meant.
Right.
And be willing to communicate.
I think you're right. She might even start with acknowledging that there might have been a breach of his privacy and taking accountability for that.
Okay. Should we move on to the next question?
Sure. I am currently listening to episode 45 of your podcast concerning sexual intimacy during and after pregnancy. I have a question that I do not believe that you touched on. No pun intended. How is the male partner meant to cope with the new mother's changes in libido and desire if masturbation is prohibited halachically? At what point does masturbation become in any way permissible?
So let me take the last line first. At what point does masturbation become in any way permissible? So I am not going to say that according to Jewish law, masturbation is ever permissible. That would be going against essentially all the halachic literature I've ever seen on the subject. So I want to make that clear. We've spoken about masturbation numerous times, and there's a lot to say about it. There's a difference between saying avoid guilt and don't beat yourself up versus it is now allowed according to Jewish law. We don't have to overemphasize masturbation as the Kitzur says, basically the worst sin you can do. I think we should move away from that sort of attitude, the sort of mystically inclined way of looking at it, and instead look at it as something which a person should do his best to avoid. And as we said to the previous letter writer, if you make a mistake, then okay, with one who was talking about shomer negiah, if you make a mistake, it's your choice. You can try and do it again. You can try to be better next time, so to speak. You can try to avoid the problem next time. And I'll even go further to this particular listener, Talli, maybe even more starkly. To the degree that we can make such distinctions, I have a feeling that masturbation may well be a bigger problem for somebody who's married than somebody who's single. And I say that because one of the ways of looking at masturbation, I've spoken to certain rabbis about this particular issue, one way of looking at the severity of the prohibition according to certain literature is the fact that you're taking something which is meant to be shared and instead doing it, quote unquote, selfishly. In other words, the husband and wife are supposed to experience sex together. And when they do it without their partner, they're sort of violating that contract of doing things together. Whereas someone who's single doesn't have that same issue over there. Again, I'm not trying to say it's permissible if you're single, but it could very well be. It wouldn't surprise me. This is sort of a theory which I've been thinking about. When the Talmud takes masturbation so seriously, the Talmud was written largely for married men because people then got married much younger. And therefore, it's not usually speaking to someone who's 22 years old in the Western world who's not married. There wasn't really such a thing for the most part, at least it was pretty rare. So it wouldn't surprise me if those strong warnings are specifically for someone who's married. So there's not a point when you're married now it becomes less of a prohibition. So I want to make that clear. But that's part one. Part two of my answer, Talli, is that what you have said actually before on this podcast, which is that we should stop thinking of sexual intercourse as being sex. Sexual intercourse is a type of sex, but sex is broader than sexual intercourse. Intimate touch and other very private interactions between a husband and a wife in the bedroom that don't necessarily include intercourse can still be part of what we call sex. And as we pointed out in episodes before, particularly, as I always mention, episode 8 and episode 16, there are many poskim who assert that non-vaginal sex, that includes ejaculation, is permitted, provided that it's done occasionally rather than as the primary means of having sex. What that means in practice is that there's a very big difference between a man masturbating because his libido is unsatisfied and engaging in intimate touch with his wife in some way or another, which also involves ejaculation non-vaginally. I don't know if that answers the question necessarily, but I hope it at least opens up the possibility for the writer to understand that he doesn't have to be sexually unsatisfied completely and resort, quote unquote, to masturbation. He can be together with his wife, and her bodily changes and her changes in sexual desire doesn't mean that they can have no sex whatsoever. It could be that that's what's happening there. But I think, I would guess, in most situations, the changes in libido mean that she wants something different, not necessarily complete abstinence. And if that's the case, then there are other ways of doing it that are both within the realm of halacha and don't mean that you have to say masturbation is permitted.
Okay. I mean, I think that you answered it. I have nothing more to add. My one word that everyone knows is communicate about it. Communication.
All right, then let's move on to the next question. This is a really interesting question. I mean, I think they're all interesting, but this one is sort of a thought question and could become an entire episode. What does Jewish sex look like? What should one's perspective be? How can one tap into the deeper connection while having sex? I know that you've mentioned your distaste for objectification, but how can one have sex without complimenting their spouse's body and flaunting their own as well? What's the balance? How do we overcome the superficial desire to appear sexy in order to tap into the real connection that sex contains? How can something so physical be considered Kodesh HaKodashim? Why don't you take it first, Talli, then I'll comment as well.
I love this question. It's a lot of questions in one. What does Jewish sex look like as opposed to, I guess, non-Jewish sex? And this idea of complimenting your spouse's body or engaging in this deeply kind of physical or this superficial desire to appear sexy, all this kind of sexy stuff. How could that jive with the sanctity of it, the Kodesh HaKadoshim? There's a resource that's actually really interesting. It's called The 2,000-Year Jewish Debate on Marital Intimacy. It's a book that I read not too long ago, written by Noam Zion Sachs, I believe his name is. Anyway, in this book, he kind of talks about 3 basic Jewish approaches to sexuality. He talks about the minimizing approach, the approach which is more about, I would say, sexual asceticism, rabbinic sources that seek to minimize the experience of sexual pleasure and kind of use asceticism as a preferred template. And then there are other sources, and they're particularly mystical sources, that glorify marital sexual pleasure. They consider sex to be a holy and divine gift. It's all the lectures that you've heard about the kruvim, the cherubs in the Holy of Holies, and that the act of sex itself is a halachic act. It's a holy, godly act. And then I think the third approach is probably I would say, correct one. And that's really the more Maimonidean approach, which is that all people have sex. Jews have sex just like all people have sex. And they do it for pleasure, just like they do it for procreation. There's nothing particularly Jewish about sex, but as Jews, like we do everything else, we sanctify it. We make it about our marital partner. And there are some rules attached in terms of the timing of it. But other than that, sex is sex. And sex can be really appreciated and valued in many different ways. Sometimes it feels spiritual, but sometimes it can feel kind of playful. And sometimes it can feel like a quickie to reduce stress. And sometimes it can be particularly sensual and sexual. And sometimes it can involve using language that you might not usually use in the street, because it's something very, very private.
Like Rav and Rav Kahana, that story in the Talmud. Rav Kahana was under Rav's bed, and he heard Rav talking normally and not in a holy way.
Yeah, and not in a holy way. He was talking probably romantically. I was actually thinking something a little bit more like naughty, which is fine too. But it's whatever you do. Enjoy yourselves.
I agree with what you said. I think it's very important. I'm going to quote something that is effectively from the Nefesh HaChaim. The very beginning of Hallel, the first paragraph of Hallel, there's a line that says, Ramal kol goyim Hashem al hashamayim kvodo. Elevated is God upon the nations. He is in the heavens or above the heavens, on the heavens, I guess, ultimately. It then continues, Mi kashem Elokeinu hamagbihi lashavet. Who is like Hashem our God, who is up on high, who dwells on high? Hamashpili lirot bashamayim uva'aretz, who looks down upon both heaven and earth. And it said that very often a non-Jewish, quote-unquote, way of looking at God is that God is in heaven and we're on earth. And therefore, the spiritual is way, way beyond the physical. And we should strive for that spiritual way of looking at it. God is in the heavens is the way the goyim, the non-Jews, look at the world. But who is like our God, who looks down upon both heaven and earth? Now, I'm not trying to disparage non-Jews. I'm just quoting the Nefesh HaChaim here. I'm not going to define non-Jews. But the point is for Jewish sex. Let's talk about that. Hashem looks down equally upon the heavens and the earth. Hamashpili lirot bashamayim uva'aretz. And what that means in practice is that for Jews, the spiritual is not, quote-unquote, holier than the physical. Both of them are looked down upon by God, who transcends both. He is above both of them, which means he's actually present in everything. Therefore, as Rav Steinsaltz has said in this context, that's why we care as much about the food you eat as the loftiest spiritual discussions, because we care about the physical world. We care about physicality. And I think the letter writer has made perhaps a small mistake in saying, how can something so physical be the Holy of Holies? Well, how can something spiritual be the Holy of Holies? The answer is they're both divine. They're both coming from God. And I think a way of looking at Jewish sex, or Jewish anything for that matter, is that we don't look at the physical as inferior to the spiritual. Both of them are things that are used in our road towards worshiping God. And therefore, the fact that sex is fun and playful and all the other things that you said that don't have anything to do with what I would normally consider spiritual doesn't mean they're less godly. And we have to realize that sometimes you can have one and the other. And the fact that it's more physical or more spiritual doesn't mean that one is a better thing than another. Shabbat is more kadosh, is holier than Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur is a very spiritual day. We don't do anything physical. We don't eat. We stand up all day long, all sorts of other things that sort of transcend our physicality. Shabbat, however, according to Chazal, is even holier. We have more aliyot on Shabbat than on Yom Kippur. And Shabbat is all about the Shama Yetero, which it says in the Gemara, Masechet Beitza, as interpreted by Rashi, means you want to eat more and sleep more. The holiest day is characterized by physical things. So the fact that sex is a physical pleasure has nothing to do with it being less godly. That's what I would say.
Yeah, I like that. And I also think we want to emphasize that a Jewish approach to sex is that couples connect with each other through sex. This is a very important part of the marriage, to connect to each other as partners, as re'im ahuvim. And we wish it upon couples under the chuppah when they get married. It's one of the Sheva Brachot. All the Sheva Brachot are really about wishing onto the couple this very special ability to connect together through marital intimacy.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. My wife and I have been married for 10 years and have 3 kids, 1 boy, 2 girls. My wife is terrified of getting pregnant, and while we have a heter to use a diaphragm and spermicide, she would also like me to use a condom so that she can relieve the anxiety that she has around it. My understanding of using a condom is that it is hotzaat zera levatala, which makes me uncomfortable. That's spilling seed in vain, which makes me uncomfortable using one. She had a bad reaction to hormonal birth control and is worried about using an IUD because of horror stories that she has heard. So she really wants me to use a condom. It's unfortunately causing a tremendous strain on our marriage and negatively affecting our shalom bayit. She has a lot of resentment towards me and trauma about my rejecting her sexually because in the past, our sex drives haven't lined up. She needs more and I need less. I feel that, or she needed more and I needed less. That's interesting that it's changed. I feel that my understanding of the halakha surrounding condom usage is destroying our marriage. Could you please give any insight into this or questions that say that I could be lenient on this issue? If I had a halachic validation of using a condom, I would. Thank you.
All right. So first of all, I feel for this letter writer. That's the most important point to start off with, which is that this is a very, very difficult situation to be in. It is not easy to feel that your marriage is falling apart and that it hinges on the halachic validity of a condom or not, or anything else like that. My emotions go out to the writer here. My second point I'll make again is that I don't poskin on the air. That's not something which I do. I am not a posek. I'm going to tell you certain ideas which I know. And the writer, the listener, can take it where he would like to go with it. The simple halachic answer, and this is going to be several parts here, but the simple halachic answer is that among all the types of birth control, assuming that birth control is warranted halachically in a given situation, a condom is very rarely permitted by the vast majority of halachic decisors, except in a place where there's a danger to life, such as if one partner is HIV positive. Or, for example, maybe even less so, but also if, for example, the wife gets pregnant, could be dangerous to her life as well. Those are cases where a condom might be more allowed, and the former more than the latter, because the latter can have other types of birth control, whereas in HIV positive, really a condom is more necessary. The major posek who is often quoted as allowing a condom in some circumstances is Rav Chaim Ozer Grudinsky, a very well-known posek from the time of World War II. That's a major source, obviously, and the fact that he allows it in certain circumstances should be taken very seriously. I have to note, if I'm going to be honest, the great majority of poskim have not accepted his viewpoint, and Rav Herschel Schechter has even argued that the original tshuva, where Rav Chaim Ozer says that in some situations a condom is allowed, is taken out of context, and he doesn't even mean that. He means only where there's a danger of life to the mother. So I want to point that out. The first point is that if you ask most poskim, they will say you just can't use a condom. I'm not, again, speaking to this person. I'm talking about broadly. I do want to point out that Talli, you sent me an article by Rav Shaul David Bachko, who's a Rosh Yeshiva in Israel. And I'm going to just translate one line of his relevant conclusion. He says, after discussing the issue in some depth, therefore we should know that use of a condom is also a relevant possibility when other types of birth control are not appropriate for her, even when there is no danger to the woman should she become pregnant, as long as the couple has halachic warrant to use birth control. That's part of his conclusion. He offers a number of reasons that use of a condom should not be dismissed out of hand. In preparation for this episode, I started writing down his reasoning, and I decided against saying it because we'll get us into the halachic weeds, and really that will require more background. Anyone who's interested can look up this particular article that is produced by the Soho organization. It's in the Hebrew original. Let me just say the bottom line over here for this particular letter writer and for people in general asking this question about condoms. The vast majority of poskim do not allow the use of condom in any situation short of danger to the mother's life, or perhaps the father's life, in the case of HIV positive. However, Rav Bachko's tshuva is an interesting addition to the halachic discourse. And while the fact that he says this doesn't suddenly mean, oh, I guess it's allowed, we can all use it, that's not what he's saying, and it's not how halacha works. We don't suddenly say someone is makil, someone is lenient, therefore everyone can just rely on that leniency in all situations. That's not how the discourse works. Nevertheless, his arguments must be taken seriously. Should there be a pressing need for a condom? And even if the mother's life is not technically at risk, in a situation like this, where their marriage is in serious danger, I would suggest that when he does speak to his halachic decisor, he raise this particular tshuva by Rabashko and see how that can be entered into the larger conversation.
Thank you for that. I would make this kind of macro point, and then I'm going to make a micro point about this particular couple. But the macro point is that I'll often hear from women in general, religious women will talk about the birth control options only being options that affect them in their body, and having to deal with hormonal birth control, which is not always a great option, diaphragms, which are not always a great option. No option is really good, and sometimes a condom would be the best, but the one thing that would require the partner is the one thing that is not an option. So that's kind of more on the macro level. On the micro level for this particular couple, she has a lot of anxiety. And not really able to be that flexible. And in a way, the way I would read her is that she's kind of saying to her husband, are you willing to step out of your comfort zone in order to keep me secure, to keep me safe? I feel like what we're doing is not keeping me safe. And I need you to do this for me so that I will feel secure, so that we can have sex and I won't be afraid. And, this might be not so true necessarily. In other words, she could feel safe in other ways, perhaps, but it sounds like she needs her husband to do this for her, and that there is some meaning to him doing this for her that would allow her to feel that you are choosing me. You're choosing me over what she might be seeing as rigidity to the letter of the law. And so that's why, I tend to kind of go deeper into what's really happening with this couple. And in this particular case, if it is so destructive potentially to their shlom bayit and to their intimacy and to their marriage, I would hope that they would be able to get a lenient decision. And it's not making a macro decision, but it's really understanding that this is a case where actually the husband really needs to have some rabbinic permission to give his wife what she really needs.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you. Should we move on to the next question?
Sure.
I would like to express my sincerest and heartfelt gratitude to the both of you for your podcast series. Oh, thank you. I stumbled on it this week and have been listening to it for hours and hours as I find it so interesting. I would also like to let you know that I'm only 20 years old, probably not your typical aged listener.
You'd be surprised.
Yeah. I don't know if there is a typical age listener. For the past 3 years, I've been struggling with masturbation and pornography. I've been feeling a lot of shame and guilt, which I know is probably not a good thing from your podcast. But I have decided I'm going to try extra hard this Elul to sober up. And including today, I have been sober for 5 days. I know this isn't a lot, but I would like to think it's better than nothing. Let me just stop there. Yes, of course. Celebrate whatever victory you have. If that is something you're working on, of course, I certainly agree with that. I still struggle with certain things surrounding sexuality, but I would like to think I am trying. I would like to attribute a lot of this to finding your podcast series and the amazing insights you guys have been giving over in them. I don't talk about this issue or sexuality with anyone, and I think your podcast series has really helped me understand a lot about sexuality. Your halachic and psychological insights have been so informative, interesting, and eye-opening. I really can't thank you guys enough. I do have one question. I've been a very introverted person since I can remember and never really had many friends or social interactions. As of late, I've been feeling a need to connect with someone, to be vulnerable and open with someone, particularly a person of the opposite sex. Do you have any advice on what I can do? I seem to be stuck and very lonely as of late, and it makes things difficult for me.
Okay, well, thank you very much for all that feedback. This is why we do what we do. I think I'm just going to address the loneliness. I think it can be a lonely age. I don't know, where you are, if you're in yeshiva or if you're in the army or if you're in some other framework. And I guess I would want to know more about the framework that you're in. I just think it just makes so much sense to be 20 years old and to want to connect with somebody and to be vulnerable. It's developmentally a very good sign of your being normal and healthy. I think the issue here really isn't so much you. It might be kind of a cultural or social issue in terms of what is socially appropriate in your particular culture, which you didn't really say. I think it just makes sense that you would want to perhaps start to date. I know 20 is young, at least I think it's young. I know that there are plenty of young men getting married at 20 and young women. And also you mentioned that you're introverted. So the idea of being social and being social with people of the opposite sex who you might not have had a lot of experience with can feel daunting. So advice on what you can do. Well, as I said before on this podcast, I'm not really good at advice, but I really would open up to somebody who you value and trust, whether it's an older sibling or a parent or a friend or a coach or a Rebbe that you are close with, or even a therapist. I do think that it might be helpful to speak to somebody and to kind of talk about what are the ways that you can start to fill your loneliness, whether it's by dating or whether it's by joining some kind of groups or hobbies that might involve socialization and getting to know people with similar interests. And I wish you a lot of hatzlacha.
And thank you for the kind things you said about our podcast. It means a lot to us.
Yes. I assume the answer to this question is no, but with respect to Rabbanim who take a machmir view, that means a less lenient view, on permissible sexual activities, would they incline towards leniencies if the female partner is no longer of childbearing age? Again, I assume they make no such distinctions, but I'm curious. Okay, so you, I guess, Scott, are going to have to represent the Rabbanim who take a machmir view.
Okay, I'll do that. This is a really good question. I think that the questioner is assuming that those who hold that non-vaginal sex is prohibited believe that the problem is that it cannot lead to pregnancy. Accordingly, if a woman is no longer of childbearing age, and of course, halacha says sex is allowed then anyway, because it can't lead to pregnancy anyway, the problem of having non-vaginal intercourse should be mitigated. I think that's the assumption of the question. And of course, this would apply in situations beyond that which the questioner mentioned, such as when the husband is unable to have children, or for example, when they're already pregnant. She's not going to get more pregnant, so there's more reason to be lenient, assuming that assumption is correct. So the real question is that the reason why non-vaginal sex is prohibited according to those authorities who prohibit it? And the answer is that some say that's the reason, but not all. There are several reasons that are given for why non-vaginal sex is prohibited. Again, for those who say that it is, one of which is that it could be an unauthorized form of birth control. And connected to that is that it's the avoidance of the mitzvah of pru urvu, the mitzvah of being fruitful and multiplying. According to those authorities, those Rishonim who say that that's the problem, it would stand to reason that we could be more lenient in a case where that's no longer an issue. On the other hand, there are other reasons that are given as well, and I think most poskim look at them nowadays en masse. They don't look at one reason or another, but they take it all. I think that Rav Schechter's idea kind of represents the general attitude. In the Journal of Halacha and Contemporary Society, I believe it was issue number 4, in an article entitled Halachic Aspects of Family Planning, he said, and I'm quoting him, whenever tashmish, that means intercourse, is performed in a normal fashion, even though it is clear that no pregnancy can possibly result, this does not constitute wasting of the husband's seed. I think this is the most common way of thinking about permissible sexual activities and, in contrast, prohibited sexual activities. What we might call, to use a term which isn't really a Jewish term, but the integrity of the act. If they're having sex in the quote-unquote normal way, vaginal sex, because of that, that would make it permitted or prohibited depending on what you want. Pregnancy is a secondary consideration. So really what I'm saying ultimately is that there are a lot of people out there, there are a lot of poskim out there. I'm not going to make sweeping statements. It certainly stands to reason that according to those Rishonim who say that the primary issue is the problem of birth control or the problem of avoiding pregnancy, then it would stand to reason that they would be more lenient if the wife is postmenopausal. Practically speaking, I believe that most poskim don't really take that into consideration for the most part. And for them, it's really about vaginal sex versus non-vaginal sex, and the reasoning is secondary. If it's allowed, it's allowed. If it's not allowed, it's not allowed. And the woman's status as being able to get pregnant or not is not so relevant to this question. That's my feeling.
All right, great.
Okay, let me do the next question, Talli. I love my husband. We have a beautiful life with wonderful children, an open home, vibrant communities, great careers, travel. We are blessed. We simply have mismatched sex drives. I have much more libido and desire than he does. We've been to certified sex therapists and have made negligible progress. We communicate about it. We schedule sexual time. It's less than satisfying. I don't expect intercourse and have a broad definition of sexual. I masturbate a lot. He's been to doctors. There is a physiological issue. We are just poorly matched that way. We are frum, and we would not have an open marriage. I become depressed thinking I'm never going to have a sexually satisfying life. Thoughts? Ooh.
It is
That's
sad
difficult.
to read. It's difficult to read, but I think that there might be a typo because there is no physiological issue. I assume that there's not a physiological issue.
I'm wondering if
Because
that's
we're
what,
just
yeah.
poorly matched that way. Yeah.
Yeah. Let's work with the assumption there's no physiological issue.
Yeah. Yeah. Look, sex therapists will, in general, say that this is the most common issue. This idea of having disparate drives, whether it's the woman who wants more than the man or the man who wants more than the woman. And more sex therapists are talking about seeing more men with less drive than women. You know, there's different camps around how to treat this. And certainly there's the sexual medicine camp that will say, you know, even though you believe there's no physiological issue, there may be a testosterone deficiency and we have medications that will help. And, you know, anybody who follows sexual medicine gurus will hear all of the physiological and hormonal additives that can help to boost libido. And that's true for men and that's true for women. And in fact, we do have to consider those physiological possibilities. You know, I mean, it may be that they have tried everything and they have been to several sex therapists. So I'm going to assume that their sex therapists knew what they were doing and tried to help them. Because I'm a couples therapist and I do sex therapy in the context of really seeing what's going on with a couple, I do see that she's presenting this very kind of idealized picture. We have a beautiful life, wonderful children. We travel together. We're blessed. Everything's great. It's just about the sex. It's just about the sex. So my sense is that they went to a few sex therapists and they said, you know, well, if it's just about the sex, then let's just do some behavioral therapy around sex and see if we can change it. And it didn't work and it was frustrating. What I might do with a couple like this is kind of get a better understanding of also the dynamics of their marriage, because very often there is some sort of dynamic that also plays into the sexual dynamic. But let's just say they also went to somebody who did all that.
I was going to ask you, let's assume they've done all of that so far.
All right, let's assume they've done all of that. Sometimes we just need to mourn for what we don't have. It is really sad. And She said that she masturbates a lot. And I would wonder about the loneliness issue. And I would wonder about the isolation for her. And if her husband is willing, even though he might not have the same desire, would he be willing to be there with her? Would he be willing to be part of her fantasy world? And would he be willing to provide some, again, erotic empathy, some acknowledgement that, even though he's not down to have sex with her as frequently as she would want, is he able to acknowledge her sexuality? Is he able to acknowledge what it is that she would like? And this goes for couples where it's the other way around too. It's the same thing. Or does he react defensively? Does he avoid? Does he, ignore? I mean, I do think it's important to look at the dynamics. But this idea of I become depressed thinking I'm going to never have a sexually satisfying life, it really is depressing if you feel that you've gone as far as you can go and that you've hit a wall. And there would be a mourning process that would need to happen around that. And again, like I hate to keep saying, well, therapy, go to therapy, but there really is no quick answer to this. This leaves me with more questions than it does with the ability to provide these like quick tips because, I'm not good with tips. I don't think that saying something to her like, well, did you try some lingerie? Did you brush your teeth and floss? I mean, I'm pretty sure that she's tried all that.
She's probably tried that.
So I'm not going to. Yeah. I don't know that I would give up in terms of, finding a good therapist, but you might have to, because I don't know, again, like I don't know enough about the dynamics in the marriage to know how much more willing her partner is, because the distress generally lies with the higher desire partner, it said, and the lower desire partner usually just has more kind of power, more leverage. They're like less distressed about the situation. They're less likely to want to go to therapy. And that makes it hard. It makes it really hard.
The very fact that the writer has an idealized understanding of her life, beautiful life, wonderful children, travel, everything's perfect, except for this. And it's not physiological, assuming we're reading that correctly. Yeah. You start to say, well, is this really an accurate picture? Is everything going on as, is this really what's happening? It's very, very hard.
I don't question whether it's accurate. I would never question that. My curiosity would be, in that direction. It sounds like everything is great. And her sense is that everything really is great. So it is. But I would also want to understand more about the dynamic.
Let's do one last question, Talli, okay?
Okay. I am going in the next few days to a urologist about my erectile dysfunction. I checked out online what a urologist is testing for, and I see that they're likely going to artificially give me an erection and take some tests. I also heard that they sometimes need a sample of semen. Should I let them do it?
Okay, so this is an interesting halachic question. Again, I'm not a post-psych, but I'll tell you what I found looking this up. There wasn't that much I found about having an erection in the context of a medical procedure. The issue is this, which is that halachically, there is a prohibition of having an intentional erection, not in the context of sex with one's wife. In fact, I'm going to read it because I think it's important. It's from the Gemara in Masechet Nida, page 13b. I'll read it in English. I'll translate as I go along. Someone who intentionally gives himself an erection is excommunicated. That's in the name of Rav. So the Gemara asks, why don't you just say that it's prohibited? What's this excommunication? Because he is inciting the Yetzer Hara on himself. He's inciting his evil urge on himself. And Rav Ami says that someone who does this, who has an erection intentionally, is called an avaryan, a sinner. Because this is the job of the Yetzer Hara, of the evil inclination. It tells someone do this, and the next day do this, and eventually he becomes an idol worshiper, etc., etc. I'm not going to read the whole thing. The reason I'm reading this particular Gemara, aside from the fact that it's a major source that says that having an erection not in the context of sex with one's wife is prohibited if it's done on purpose, and the Gemara seems to imply that having an erection is under the person's control.
Because it's not. An erection is a completely autonomic nervous system is not, but okay.
Talli, I fully accept that. The question here really is how we explain the phrase ein kishoy el ledat. An erection only happens by knowledge, dot. What that phrase dot means, even if it's automatic, what does the phrase dot mean? That's a question for a different time. But the point here is that the prohibition of intentionally going to arousal, causing an erection, seems to me, from this Gemara, to be in the context of inciting your Yetzer Hara. Over and over, that's the context. He says, why don't you just say it's prohibited? Because you're excommunicated because you're intentionally inciting the Yetzer Hara. And similarly, you are a sinner. Why are you called a sinner? Because that's the Yetzer Hara's strategy. First, he'll get you to do this, then that, then that. All of this does not sound anything to do with medical procedures. It sounds a lot like you're trying to do it to have a minimal form of arousal without ejaculating. And then next thing you know, you're doing something which is more serious. At least from my perspective, it seems to me, and again, I did not have enough time to really look into this deeply. I didn't see that much on it, though, that a medical procedure that would involve erectile dysfunction, particularly, I'll say even further, if it's in order for a person to have a normal sex life with his spouse, that makes it even more obvious, should be okay, because the problem here seems to me, again, in my opinion, to be the context of inciting your Yetzer Hara. That's not the context in a doctor's office. Anyway, that's what I would say about that.
And also, it's completely physiological. It's not based on arousal. It's based on increasing the blood flow.
You're saying in the doctor's office?
Yeah.
Right, yeah. So I would assume that the prohibition is arousal, not doing something artificially to increase the blood flow. That's what I would,
Right.
Okay. All right, Talli, I think that's all we have time for this time, but that was a really interesting group of questions. I'm glad the listeners sent them in, and I appreciate it.
And keep them coming.
Thank you very much, everyone, for listening and for sending in your questions. Once again, if we didn't get to your question, please send us a reminder. We'll try to get to you eventually. We'll do our best. Remember to check out the website, intimatejudaism.com, for the podcast archive, show notes, a free men's mikvah checklist, and more. Subscribe to Intimate Judaism. Tell people about Intimate Judaism. Join the Intimate Judaism team on Patreon. Go to TallyRosenbaum.com and JewishCoffeehouse.com and write to us, intimatejudaism@JewishCoffeehouse.com. Thanks for listening.
Bye.